I think a lot of composers have this sort of public-private dichotomy. I think about that with Bartók, for instance. And maybe that's a little bit of what's going on, is that on a large canvas, in a larger venue with a larger group of musicians, you're sort of in public mode. And then when I'm writing a flute and piano piece for a couple of my friends, it's like, okay, now I can really do something weird and specific that is kind of knocking around my ear. I'm very particular about how I like my workspace, as I can tell you are too.
Yeah, it's pretty, yeah.
And that extends to what is
on the screen,
on my computer screen.
Yeah.
And the just the design of the program, the way it's designed modally and hierarchically, and the way it's designed aesthetically and visually, are to me just like a pleasure. Whereas
I've never had that word associated with Sibelius.
No, Sibelius is a pile of, I started using Sibelius in 2001 with like version 1.4. So like I know the stuff that is still the same in it. And it's like,
wow, 1.4?
Kind of a lot.
God, I thought I was early. I was, I think Sibelius 2 or 3.
They just stack and stack and stack on the foundation that they've had. I mean, even if you just go back to Sibelius 6, which is like, what, 2009 or 10?
I don't even know, because then they started calling it like Sibelius Ultimate at some point to make you forget. Like
that was recent though,
Okay.
like because Sibelius 6, a lot of people were using Sibelius 6 for a decade because they didn't like Sibelius 7.
Yeah, because they changed the interface completely.
Yeah, but like then that was just a blanket. It was like a new facade on just the same old program. And you dig not that deep, and it's the same sort of hierarchy of dialogues and sort of like frustrating inadequacies and everything that frustrated you about the program before. Well, guess what? They didn't fix it, So
well, it's funny because like a few months ago on this channel, I had a poll just to see. I didn't even know if people would respond. I had like maybe 1,000 subscribers at this point. So I thought, okay, if I put a poll out, maybe like, I don't know, 10 people would respond or something. I had like almost 200 people respond to this thing. And I asked them, what program do you use? So I put Dorico, Sibelius, Finale, and MuseScore.
Yeah.
Guess which one had the biggest percentage?
MuseScore.
MuseScore.
Yeah.
It was like over 50%.
I'm not surprised.
And
I mean, it's free.
And it's free. That's why.
Yeah.
Okay. But still, I was thinking, I've never even heard of the program before.
But also, you said,
living under a rock over here.
You said your audience is not necessarily professional composers. It's like
who is?
Aspiring composers.
Who is a professional composer?
Right, well,
I want to know.
I mean, I'm not full time, but
if I was a professional composer, I'd probably not have time to do this. But no, but seriously, yeah, no, I was surprised, and then I started looking up some tutorials of MuseScore. I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. It's not bad.
The new version, I think it's version 4.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like a huge improvement. I mean, I haven't used it personally, but I've had a few students who have, and prior to the new version, I was kind of like, well, you really gotta invest in a real notation program, like, because this is not doing the job. And now it's like, oh, this could kind of work,
Yeah.
In terms of the level of detail that you need for like professional publishing, you probably still need one of the big 3.
The big 3 being Dorico, Sibelius, Finale.
Yeah.
So you would say those are still the big 3 now?
Yeah, though I've never had a student who was a Finale user, so I think they're losing the young generation.
Yeah, same. I've never seen. I mean, I think I've opened the program maybe less than 10 times, like 10 years ago, and you get that kind of
I have a couple
response.
A couple colleagues, people my age. I know some people who are Finale power users, but they've been using it since early 2000s.
Upstairs we were talking about Stephen Harkey, a composer, professor, and he still uses Score.
Really?
Yes.
So he composes by hand and then does the engraving?
Yes. All through Score.
I
don't know if he still does that.
That's very him.
Score, by the way, is like this. It's like the original version of any of these notation programs, right? It's the first or second.
Well,
or
it's
maybe
it's not a notation program. It's an engraving program. You can't compose in it. It's really just a graphical layout program for musical symbols. And if you know what you're doing, you can. I mean, I know some score. I have some scores that I know were made in Score that are just absolutely beautiful. But it's like, it's analogous to what music engravers were doing with like lead plates, by hand. It's like that amount of labor intensive. It's just on the computer,
Yeah, but he swears by it. I don't know what it's like. This is 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago, so I don't know what he's doing now. But I remember him saying, yeah, he does it through Score, and it's just as fast as doing it through Sibelius. I said, okay, fine.
Whatever works
Yeah.
for you. I mean, I know David Lang uses also some weird program. I don't even know the name of it, but it's like some really outdated engraving program that it can do a certain type of rhythmic transformation that is really important in his music. And it's my goal to get him to switch to Dorico, because Dorico can actually also do this. But I don't think he's ever going to switch.
Well, I mean, speaking of scores, we're talking about scores and composing, engraving, all that. All that doesn't matter though if we don't hear something, right? So let's take a listen to one of your pieces. This is your Dark Patterns for Orchestra.
I mean, I think the 10-minute orchestra piece format, I mean, it's obviously so standard and like everyone has at least one, but I think it's secretly really hard. It's easy to do too much in it, and you hear that all the time, these just like overstuffed, unfocused 10-minute orchestra pieces. But then it's also like, it is kind of a longish stretch of time uninterrupted. Like it has to be meaty in a certain way. I've always sort of tried to avoid this dichotomy that you often hear of a striking, attention-grabbing opening, and then maybe 30 seconds later, contrasting idea. And that you hear this kind of template time and time again. And so I guess for me, like, I'm always trying to, in all my pieces, but especially in this piece, sort of trying to push an idea as far as it needs to go until it becomes something else, so that it doesn't feel rote in that way. It's like, okay, I'm going to push this sort of musical process to the point where it either sort of flips back over and has to restart, or that it is kind of forced to transform into the next thing. And so I think that is what sort of happens there, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes into the piece, where this kind of motoric, rhythmic, gradually intensifying series of chords flips back over to the first chord, but then it transforms itself into a different guise, and that guise happens to be melodic.
I mean, it makes sense. And I think that when you introduce the melody, I mean, I've only played the part that starts with the melody. I would have liked to maybe play the opening too, to understand what we're talking about here. But when you introduce the melody, it's not, to me, it made a lot of sense, because I was already hearing this little fragment of a cadence in the violin. In the first violin, you hear this thing that's kind of like a 5/1 cadence that gets longer and longer, but it's like really in the background. You kind of have to, it's like poking at you, you know?
Exactly.
And then you get the melody. And
neither thing is totally absent from the other thing. So even in the melodic section, there's that little chattering motor that's still going. And it's still on the same note. It's just that note is now pivoted to being the third of the chord rather than the root of the chord. You know?
But like, you don't need to know any of that stuff when you're listening, because it feels like it's embedded in the language, which that's my favorite part about especially orchestral music, because you're trying to figure out, how do I get all these players to do this one or two things in this short amount of time, right? But then I want to put my creativity in it too, without feeling like I'm dubbing down.
Well,
for the medium.
Yeah, the medium is the problem when you're writing for orchestra, right?
Yeah.
It's a very anti-composer medium in a lot of ways. I mean, I have the feeling when I'm writing for orchestra that I have to have everything be bulletproof and everything be self-explanatory in the score, in a way that I don't necessarily when I'm writing for other smaller combinations, you know? So in that way, I find that, you know, if I were to critique the piece, I would say that it feels maybe a little pat. It feels a little, you know, it's in this sort of nice, neat box, and everything kind of works. I think it works, but that maybe other things I've written have more of a sense of mystery to them, or more of a sense of the unexpected, or are just a little bit more quirky and personal, maybe. And there are other pieces that I feel this dichotomy between, you know. I think they tend, you know, I think a lot of composers have this sort of public-private dichotomy. I think about that with Bartok, for instance. And maybe that's a little bit of what's going on, is that on a large canvas, you know, in a larger venue with a larger group of musicians, you're sort of in public mode. And then when I'm writing a flute and piano piece for a couple of my friends, it's like, okay, now I can really let loose.
That's
and
so funny.
I can really just do something weird and specific that is kind of knocking around my ear.
It's funny. It's funny that you say that, because I feel exactly the same way. That's exactly the way I think. I just finished an orchestra piece literally like 3 days ago.
Is this the LA Phil piece?
Yeah. And
congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But it was the same feeling. It was like actually kind of similar story. Like you talking about your piece, Dark Patterns, is the same story with me, because it's like, okay, I got this opening thing, but it's got to change to something else, you know, 2 minutes or so, 3 minutes into the piece. And then, okay, the whole piece is just about those two things.
Yes.
And that's your piece too, but it's done well. That's the thing. There's nothing to feel, I feel like, pat about or anything. It's that's what that medium needs, and it's literally what I did as well.
And it goes, I think, one thing I always talk about with my students is that applies vertically as well as horizontally. You know, it applies to the number of things that are happening at once and the number of things that are happening over the stretch of time occupied by the piece. And that with orchestra, you actually have to be more focused, not, you know, on sort of the the verticality of it, because it's so easy for things to get muddy. It's a mistake I've made, many times myself, of just setting too many things going, and then suddenly they're all going at the same time, and it's this like Ivesian chaos. And it can be really hard to sort that out. And, if I were a different composer, maybe it would be fine. And for Ives, it was fine. Like, you listen to the comedy from the Fourth Symphony, it's like, no orchestra with no amount of rehearsal time is going to be able to sort through this texture. It's just impracticable. The impracticable nature of it is the point. Whereas for me, I always want things to be really clear.
Right, and you have a certain agenda from bar to bar. I mean, that's very clear from your music, especially, that you have an agenda for why that bar exists. It's not like a filler bar or something, which I feel like is a common thing in a lot of new music.
I care very deeply about
old music too, actually.
The integrity of the structure and the economy of the language, I guess. Just as, when I'm writing prose, I don't want to repeat the same word too many times. I don't want to overstuff the sentence. I want it to be parsable. And I guess it all comes back to like, are you a composer who thinks about your audience, or are you not? And I think some composers don't think about their audience at all, and it's a choice. But I think about the audience constantly, or I should say the listener, not the audience, because there are all sorts of ways you can experience music. But how is the listener going to experience that amount of time differently because my music is occupying it, I mean, it's cliche to say at this point, a composer's medium is time. True. I mean, it's inarguably true. But I guess I see that as a great responsibility that would not exist if I were, say, a visual artist, or a painter. If I were hanging a painting on the wall, it's like, okay, you can walk right by it, or you can pause in front of it and look at it for however long you want. But, if you listen to Dark Patterns, that's 10 minutes of your life.
Yeah, but you're not going to get back.
Yeah, exactly. That's a huge responsibility.
But it could be, for the right listener, it could be, that was a 10 minutes, not just well spent, but it could change a listener too. There's a flip side.
That's the goal.
That's the goal. Yeah, that's the responsibility you have. Absolutely. And I mean, I feel the same way. I was just at a concert yesterday. It was mostly Mozart Festival at Lincoln Center at the David Geffen Hall, the new Geffen Hall where the New York Philharmonic plays. And I saw Amir El-Safar, this trumpet player, jazz trumpet, but also Iraqi maqam. He's very well versed in that, and he had this huge 40-minute, not full orchestra, kind of sinfonetta with the kind of jazz-ish, but mixed with Iraqi instruments band.
Oh wow!
It was a huge fusion of stuff, but it was really well done. 40 minutes of that, intermission, Mozart Mass in C minor.
Whoa!
But the whole time I was thinking, both these pieces are really, really long, and they both don't work if they don't know how to use time correctly. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is cliche, but what else is it though? What else is it really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really, it's still a dichotomy in the field, I think. I think there was certainly a time in 20th century modernism where it was sort of forbidden to say you were thinking about the audience or listeners or, anyone but yourself and your colleagues in the field. But to me, I don't know. I mean, that in a way, I see that as you're playing on easy mode. You're abnegating responsibility, because then the stakes are lower. It doesn't matter so much how long you choose to spend on an idea, and if it's clear what's happening in the through line of the piece. Now, I think there's a flip side to it, which is that it's possible to write music that's very clear, that is also very bland and uninteresting, because it's clear because we've heard music which works this exact way before, and it's just sort of being remixed or repackaged or whatever. That is, I think, especially the kind of dialectic that we're dealing with in writing for orchestra, because it's so much a balance of what is expedient, what is practical, and then what do we actually want to do? What are we interested in? What is new and interesting to our ears? And how can we sort of write that in the clearest way possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone knows the answer to
No,
that.
not.
That's
I'm not saying there is an answer.
I don't think there is, yeah. But I think at a certain point when you're writing a lot of shorter works, I know you say 10-minute pieces are difficult, but once you kind of crack that code of figuring out, okay, I'm only be disciplined to deal with one or two ideas, I feel like after that, a composer can get kind of tired of that. And maybe I'm just speaking about myself mostly.
No, I'm very tired of 10-minute pieces. And at this point in my career, I would love to be working on slightly larger canvases with slightly larger amounts of time. And that's something I've done at a couple of points in my career, but actually never with orchestra, never with orchestra alone. And that's something that has been on my mind for years now, is like, what could I say in half an hour with an orchestra that is not in any of my 10 to 13 minute orchestra pieces, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have a larger canvas like that, you can do the really kind of simple, bare things in it too, and then do the really complex things and kind of go back and forth. Whereas with an orchestra, it's hard to have that wide spectrum. Mm-hmm. And I think you do this really well in my little segue here, your piano trio, because it's a long piece. It's like
20 minutes,
20-ish. It's not half an hour, but it's still, I mean, double the length of a 10-minute piece.
But it feels, I know what you mean. It has a heft to it.
It feels important.
It feels big, and it feels like there's a real progression across the three movements.
Yeah, so let's hear a couple of minutes of that. This is from the last movement, I believe. You have this bit of guitar strumming and the violin and the cello. And there's like this super, super simple melody that comes out of it. But it's like at the right moment, you know, you're like near the end of the piece, you're ready for it. You've heard so much stuff, and then you expect, like, you have this chitara thing, this guitar technique where you're strumming on the violin and the cello.
Sort of alternating normal pits and left-hand pits, but at the 16th note. So it's a little like a la guitarra.
Yeah, like sounds like a guitar.
Sounds cool. Yeah.
But then right after that, like I expected it to go to this kind of pizzicato heaven or whatever you call it.
To develop more and more. And just as the first two movements kind of push and push and push until they get really big and extreme and dense, and they're both like, you know, these tight fists as structures. And then the last movement, which I actually call a coda, even though it's a whole movement, it is just kind of, it relaxes, it spreads out. It's just this very simple song form, actually. I mean, that melody just, it occurs, it's a melody and a verse and a chorus, and it occurs, 3 or 4 times, and then there's a little end part, and then it's over. I think that movement would be nice on its own, but it feels like the structure is kind of tensing itself up progressively, and it's coiling itself up until, again, it reaches a point at which it can kind of go no further, and it's forced to end. But both the first movement, which is kind of almost a quasi-fugal texture, and then the second movement, which is a kind of a wild scherzo. I mean, it is a scherzo. It's a scherzo with a trio even, and it does the same thing at the end. It becomes just like really, really intense. So yeah, the third movement kind of felt to me like it had to be this very placid, very simple. Not that it doesn't develop, because it does. It gets the filigree and ornamentation around the melody and the harmony both get more involved, but it doesn't really change. It's like a song. I mean, it just sticks to the same melody, and there are no words, obviously, so you need something else to kind of narrate it, and that's what the instrumental texture and the harmony are doing. They're kind of telling the story.
Oh, wow, I didn't think about it that way. That's really cool. So it's like no words, so you have to explain what the narrative is somehow.
There's no narrative. I mean, I didn't have anything in mind.
Pretend narrative.
But it's a song without words, you
right.
know? Yeah, you can imagine it being a kind of ballad or something. To me, it has a very storytelling quality. There's this sort of mode, this bardic mode that composers have sometimes occupied. The Brahms Opus 10 ballades, I think, are in this mode, this sort of storytelling mode.
Mm-hmm.
The opening solo of Prokofiev's second concerto is marked narrante, narrating. You're telling the story. The piano is telling the story. And so I think of this piece as being kind of in that, occupying that trope, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and you play piano yourself too. Were you playing on this recording here? You actually sent me 2 recordings. You sent me an older recording from
the older recording would be
the newer recording, the one from 2020.
That is me playing.
That is you playing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you are a pianist, like with a capital P, not just me bullshitting back there on the keyboard. You actually play.
Well,
piano.
I do a lot of bullshitting on the keyboard myself, but yes, it's sort of. I mean, it's half my career.
Yeah.
It has always. I started as a pianist during my training, during the time I was in school. Sort of switched more seriously to being a composer, and went to school as a composer always. I never went to school as a pianist, just because it seemed to me to be the more interesting lifestyle and the slightly lower stress lifestyle.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all. So you play piano, you're doing it seriously, but then you go to school for composing. See,
I always had the sense.
I don't understand.
I always had the sense, this is something that will always be a big part of my life, and I'm never going to stop doing it. But right now, what I need to focus on is being a composer, because I would rather be a composer who plays the piano than a pianist who also composes. I think we.
Okay.
I mean, you can look at many examples and say, I mean, there are a number of world famous pianists with, international touring careers who are composers, and they aren't really part of the conversation because everyone just sort of slots them into that virtuoso pianist pigeonhole.
Kind of happens too with conductors that compose. Mm-hmm. There are also composers that conduct.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see it now. That makes sense.
So it wasn't that I made such a calculated decision, but it also had to do with the fact that I never liked participating in piano competitions, or I was never good at taking auditions as a pianist. I always loved performing, But by the time I was applying to college, I was already very intent on performing a lot of contemporary work. I was very interested in sort of that being my path forward as a pianist rather than playing Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert. And so that's really what I focused on, especially in those early years, was playing my own music, but also playing music by my colleagues, music by other living composers, just sort of going out and finding those things that maybe weren't being performed quite so much and structuring programs around them. I had always been very interested in this idea of how to structure a concert program, and felt that was a big part of sort of what I could do as a performer. And then, little by little, as I came out of school and started figuring out who I was as a pianist, I started working more canonical music into my programs and older music, but always in ways which juxtaposed it with contemporary work and kind of put it in what I thought would be a new light, a different light than, if I was going to play Schumann Kreuzleriana, I was not going to program it how any other pianist would program
Yeah, I can imagine
Kreuzleriana. And so that has sort of been my journey as a pianist. And I spent many years early on in my time in New York as more of sort of a new music gigging pianist, just playing with ensembles and presenters like all over the city, doing a lot of small new music things and sort of cutting my teeth, I guess you could say, learning a lot of really hard music really quickly, which, sometimes it went well, sometimes it didn't. But at a certain point, I began to be frustrated with that model because it never really allowed one to dig in that much. There was never enough rehearsal time. There was never enough practice time. There were always one-offs, and
you're kind of like a hired gun, kind of
exactly,
the mercenary
exactly.
of the piano.
Which I think is a great thing to do when you're a younger musician. And you get a lot of experience. You get these chops of learning and putting together complex music very quickly, which I think certainly are important skills to learn. But, I saw it less and less as a way to sort of make a satisfying artistic life in music. So now I guess I'm focused more on sort of programming my own recitals and doing the occasional orchestral concerto gig, and just sort of figuring it out from there.
I mean, being a composer, I feel like, versus a pianist, it's like kind of analogous, I feel like, to being, we were talking about basketball upstairs earlier, like being a coach versus being a player. I feel like at a certain point with players, it's just hard to be doing that for a long time. Whereas a composer, I mean, you can be like Verdi and be, and writing until your 80s, So I think there's something to be said about that, I feel like.
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways in both professions to kind of find a niche and make yourself useful in a way. I think if there's something that I bring to my performances of both new music and standard literature, I think what I bring to it is kind of a composer's perspective on that, a composer's ear for sort of all the structural things that we've been talking about, because that is really what I care about putting across in my performances are these sort of through lines, these, complete narratives in a piece.
Right, because otherwise the alternative is the typical program that we get all the time, which is, put the new piece in the beginning, or and then just play the rest of the order of the program how you would typically do it. Or if it's a big piece that's commissioned for somebody slightly more known, you put it like, right before the intermission, the second or third piece, and then everything around it is the same as if you were going to perform all Mozart or something.
No, I mean I've never started designing a program with any kind of template or formula.
Yeah,
it's always a complete blank slate, what do I feel like playing? What am I interested in? What connections have I noticed between, different kinds of music I love to play? I was just doing this past season this program that alternates Scott Joplin rags and Chopin mazurkas.
Oh, wow.
Which was just something that I sort of felt in my exploration of these works on my own time. I just sit at the piano and sight read through these books. And for whatever reason, these things kind of struck me in relation to each other as being somehow related. And I'm not even sure I can explain quite why I felt that. But, I think when you sort of weave in and out of composers like alternating like that, it just makes you hear them both differently.
To me also, when you're developing these programs, you're developing programs where you're playing at a concert, right? When you have a bunch of pieces in a row. But also I feel like your series that you do on your YouTube channel, because you have quite a following also on your channel, where you're developing programs that are actually, they're not full programs. It's just you playing one piece. It's like and usually the pieces are quite short.
Sometimes I'll do a pairing where I do two pieces in a video.
But that's it. It's not like an hour long thing that we were getting a lot on during the pandemic. I felt like we were getting all these concerts that they would just put a streamed 1 hour concert online.
I think that is not the right format for YouTube, really. As you know, it's hard to sit down and watch an hour long video and sort of, digest that whole thing. And the sort of 5 to 10 minute range is sort of more standard.
Yeah.
And that series, which, unfortunately we'd have to now, if we're being honest, say is over. I haven't posted, I think, in a year on that channel. But yeah, it was really just a way to keep my mind and my fingers occupied during those couple of years when there were not so many live performances. And also to learn some new rap and sort of show a broader audience of people just what it is I do as a pianist, because I think a lot of people just didn't know. If they knew of me at all, it was probably as a composer, and maybe he also plays piano. But I think I was able to sort of demonstrate like, this is a little bit what a Timo piano recital might look like. And I have noticed that, people who I'm talking to now about doing recitals, they have a better idea of the kind of stuff that I do. It was a kind of, we were also despairing during those years. And I think a chief source of despair was like, will anyone remember me after this is over?
That is a strange thought.
It was my way of sort of just continuing to poke the button and say like, yeah, I'm over here. I'm still here. I'm still doing stuff.
Well, it's also important to you as regardless of anyone else, it makes you feel that you're doing something too.
Yes.
It's not just, what do other people think? It's also good for you.
And
I feel like, at least that's how I felt.
I've always loved just the feeling of making something, whether it's writing a piece or making a drawing or a poster or making dinner. I just like the feeling of accomplishment of like, oh yeah, I made something. And the recording ended up being no different. I had a real, especially as I kind of refined my chops gradually and the production values sort of increased little by little, I would have a real satisfaction after every video of like, yeah, that really came out better than the last one, and how can I make it even better still next time, you know?
That's how I feel. And I don't get that feeling as much when I'm composing. Because every time I finish a new piece, I'm like, wow, that was worse than the last one. And I feel like with composing, it's so much more personal.
But there's also the time delay.
There's the time delay. It feels more personal because you're writing the thing note by note. Mm-hmm. When you're filming, it's actually kind of a passive experience because I'm not the one filming. Like some mechanical object is taking 24 frames, 30 frames a second of me, and I'm just sitting here talking like I would normally, or you're just playing like you would normally play, But
well, that's the idea, at least. Though I find that once you turn the camera on, even if you're just alone in your own living room, you play differently. It's harder.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. At least for me, I have the camera on all the time. Even sometimes when I'm working, I have the camera on. And it's just there,
just to keep you honest.
Yeah, and but then you get used to it. You just kind of get used to it. It's a good exercise, I think.
It is. It's a very good exercise, and I think my couple of years of recording and editing and listening to myself constantly taught me a lot about my own playing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, then this you were mentioning getting a broader audience and people not knowing that you were, like a professional pianist. I was one of those people. I knew you as a composer for a while, but I didn't know. Like people say, "Oh, I play the piano." I say that too. "Oh, I play the piano." No, you actually play the piano. There's a difference.
That's
because
very
when a person asks me, "Oh, what do you play?" Because I say I'm a composer, a non-musician person. I say, "Yeah." "Oh, but you must play something." "I don't really play anything." "Okay, yeah, I play the piano." But they assume that you could play. Yeah, but no, I cannot. I can't really play a lick of anything, even with a gun in my head. But I think that it's important for you to showcase that in that way and in a professional way, rather than Zoom call kind of playing that we've seen a lot of. I think it takes a lot to put yourself out there.
Well, and it's also just a question of the format. I mean, what is the YouTube format? Let's work with that as opposed to trying to make something work on YouTube that no one's really asking for. Mm-hmm. And, I watched a ton of streaming concerts during those years and some of them were brilliant. Some of them were kind of boring. Some of them had lots of technical difficulties and, it just seemed to me like, okay, I'm not really interested in like streaming myself for hours from my house. And plus, I don't think that would be very compelling. But I do think I can make these polished little things. And the recording aspect of it, especially the audio recording aspect of it, I think now gives me I have a much better understanding, not just of the technical process of recording and the things that you can do to affect it, but of my own recording process of like, okay, how do I play my best in a studio setting? Because I would really treat these little videos like I was doing a recording session. I would schedule a block of time and, block out my calendar and
even if it's at your house.
Yeah, exactly. Even if because I just felt that was sort of how I had to do it. And now I think the times that I've been in real studios since then, I have a much better sense of sort of how to pace myself, which takes are going to be the real like keeper takes. If I feel like I'm not playing well, sort of what I can do about that. So yeah, and now I have the confidence to say like, yeah, I can record some piano and I can make it sound good.
Absolutely, and it's something that you can take with you anywhere you go, basically. I mean, not just the studio, not just your home, but anywhere after that. Even doing public speaking in front of a crowd or something like that, or any of that. At least for me, it's helped a lot.
I noticed you were talking about public speaking with Clara in one of your previous interviews.
Oh yeah, with Clara Kim, the violinist. Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, that is kind of a funny aspect of our profession, because I find I'm asked to do it rather a lot, to introduce pieces or introduce programs, or if I'm playing a recital, I'll always find a spot to chat to the audience for a couple minutes. And it's something that I used to absolutely dread. I used to hate doing it. And then just being forced to do it over the years, I'm just kind of like, okay, whatever. Like it's going to be fine. And I remember specifically that when I was in grad school, we had a series, the sort of composers concerts, new music series, which is called New Music New Haven. Everyone had to introduce their piece, and almost everyone was terrible at it, because no one had learned, no one had learned how to, not just how to speak in public, but how to explain their own music in a kind of concise and compelling way.
Well, also the professors are not that great at it either.
Well, we had two who are great at it.
Yeah?
Martin Bresnik and David Lang.
Mm-hmm.
Both amazing public speakers, charismatic, great at talking about music, charming, to the point, erudite. They were both great models. And I think the rest of us were all kind of, shaking up there, saying like, okay, how can I possibly be that, articulate? And it's especially embarrassing if you're sort of talking about your own piece and you're not sure if it's any good and you're nervous for the performance and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's been fun to kind of watch the progression of all my colleagues who were there at that time sort of all become public speakers by necessity in the intervening years.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's scary, but I can tell you one example. At Juilliard, there was a composer who he got up. I think it was like a piano trio, actually. He got up. He said, "Nietzsche said, God is dead." And he got off the stage. And all of us looked around and said, yeah, maybe he's right. And then the piece played. And then we looked at each other. Yeah, that kind of describes the piece too. So it's kind of crazy how that happens, and I don't know what this composer is doing now.
One sense is maybe
I guess it doesn't really matter in that way. It's a moment in time.
Yeah,
I'm not going to forget.
Maybe they were they were shooting for something specific in terms of the aesthetic lineage that they wanted their piece to be perceived within.
Right. Right.
Maybe that's how Mahler would introduce one of his pieces at a composer's concert.
I don't know, but it was pretty wild, and I still remember it. I don't remember much composers' talks, but that one I remember because it was like 3 words,
short and to the point.
Yeah, but I wanna play something now. Actually, that you mentioned that you not boring, that's for sure, and also something that. Is quite rhythmic. It's something we haven't talked about that I want to kind of dive into. Your piece for cello and piano. I want to play a couple minutes of this. I'm noticing that there's more than most colleagues that I'm trying to think of rhythm as a profile or rhythm as an argument, and being able to use rhythm in a way where actually, on the surface, because the music you write is quite functionally tonal. It's so much.
I guess
that,
it is, yeah.
Oh, I mean, 100%.
I never really think about it that way.
No, of course you don't.
Is.
But like to anyone else, I guess to any other composer, maybe nobody else cares. But
maybe that the relations are not always so obvious, but they all do sort of tend to coagulate around certain poles, and that's sort of a big part of the way I structure music harmonically, is this sort of sense of things being drawn to a specific point sort of inexorably, and finding a way to create that feeling in harmony. So even though I don't think of chords in terms of we're going to have this chord area and then we're going to switch to this other chord, and these chords all have names and so on and so forth, it's much, much more linear and much more the way I'm sort of working out these processes horizontally. I always have, I think Tom Adès calls the magnet.
What is that?
The sort of thing that everything's drawn to.
Huh, okay.
So it's thinking of different key moments in the piece as these sort of magnetic sources that kind of pull things.
So what can a magnet
or repulse them?
What can a magnet be?
I think it is usually a note or interval or a chord that occurs at a key formal turning point in the piece.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that is the beginning or the end, But it is a way of making different aspects of the form have their own kind of teleology. I always think of the piece as sort of, here's where my music combines both like early minimalism and like integral serialism, is like splaying out the different layers of what's going on, pitch, rhythm, harmony, register, timbre, you name it, dynamics, articulation. It can really, like any component of the music that you can think of, and sort of asking myself, what is the journey of this layer of the piece over the time it occupies? And sometimes it is not applicable. I'm not saying every piece activates all these different layers, but given the material that I'm working with in any given piece, there are always a number of different things that are kind of going on. And then sort of the progression of those things, I think I tie very much back to the sort of process music of early Reich and Glass, and this sort of purer form of minimalism like that. That's sort of how it makes sense to me to activate the structure.
Mm-hmm.
So, a piece like Agita, it's very clear the thing that it starts with, the thing that is sort of the idea of the piece is it's these repeated A's with different timbres. And that was the sketch for the piece, was just like, let's think of all the different ways to articulate an A between the piano and cello. And so I had a list of these different kind of timbral ideas and worked very closely with Inbal, the cellist, to sort of figure some of them out, specific ways of bowing, specific ways of doing a pizzicato that would kind of create this kaleidoscope of different A's that would kind of activate this one note and kind of eventually break it apart.
Like this kind of music, I get kind of, especially when it's centered on one pitch, I always get kind of, personally when I'm writing, like, okay, how do I get out of that pitch? Like, how do I add a note? Like, what would be the next note after A? Like, how do you figure that out? Because you have either rhythmic stuff, it sounds like you write that out first, but then how do the other pitches come? To me, that is at least one of my big problems, is like if I introduce a pitch so incessantly like that, what is the next pitch? Like, what is the basis for the other pitch existing?
In the case of that piece, the next pitches that are introduced are as kind of upbeats. So they almost like reintroduce the cycle of A's. And there are, internal repeats in the piece that you kind of hear the same short section twice. And each time it'll have these kind of chromatic upbeats. I think you hear those chords that come in that are sort of in contrary motion, but always leading back to the A, so that when you land on the A, it sounds weirdly like an arrival, even though we've been hearing A the whole time.
It's like making those non-A pitches the not stressed in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, so rhythm is the way to do it then.
Not necessarily rhythm, though rhythm does play a huge part in the way that piece develops, but almost like phrase structure, I would say. That you might not immediately notice it because it's such a kind of pared down piece in a way, but it actually has quite a traditional phrase structure. And I think that sort of calls into our aural memory this sense of, these new harmonies belong here because they're an upbeat. We're introducing the next 16-bar unit or whatever it is. So that's the best I can kind of explain it, and that those upbeats then sort of they expand their influence from there. They kind of take over. And I'm very interested in this idea of something being taken over by another thing. I have this very early piece that's on my first record called "How Can I Live in Your World of Ideas," which is the first piece where I kind of tried this very explicitly, where it's a 2-piano piece, and it's one piano playing one material, this very simple passacaglia sense of, series of chords, and then another piano which interrupts it. First with, a single 16th note of a different harmony, and little by little that 16th note interruption expands every cycle, such that then by the end of the piece, it has become a totally different music, which has taken over the piece. Almost completely unrelated to the first material. And then there's a sort of reconciliation of them at the end. And that is also, it's very explicit in that piece because it's also, it has a sort of postmodern quality where, these kind of very 19th century sounding harmonies start coming in, and almost like quasi quotations. And it's very clear, like, this is like this kind of layering of not just different materials, but different styles. But I still love that kind of idea of juxtaposition. One could also sort of relate it to sampling, of like hearing, of setting off the main thing that's happening with just the right thing that is not of that world. And I guess I relate that to the idea of surprise or freshness in a structure, of sort of opening up the window and letting the fresh air come in, which I think there is a particular moment in Agita where that happens, right? After the sort of climactic moment, or sort of in the middle of the climactic moment in the piece, it's not even really allowed to conclude. And then suddenly it's like a jump cut into this completely different mood, different harmony, different texture, almost everything. It, of course, because I have to be a composer about it, it's related to the material from earlier, but you might not know it.
That's a weird thing that we always have to feel that it has to be related. I don't know what that is. Is this because it's Beethoven stuck in our heads?
Yeah, but for me, Brahms,
it's Brahms for you.
That sort of technical economy, I guess, of like, waste not, want not. You're either a Brahms person or you're not, and I'm on friendly terms with many who are not, so don't feel bad.
Well, let's put it this way: I'm a Timo person. I'm converted.
Sweet of you to say.
But
Timo pilled.
Timo pilled. Yeah, there you go. But if you've been Timo pilled, you can check out his complete discography right here next to the plants. And if you want to check out Timo's YouTube channel, it's down in the description below. And anything else Timo related will be down in the description below. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you so much, Saad. Nice to be in your air-conditioned basement on this 100-degree day.
Yeah, appreciate that.